Okay, so what happens with Charlemagne's empire? It was enormous. It was important politically. It was powerful. It was largely united. And then he dies. The whole chunk of it immediately passes to his one legitimate son, Louis the Pious. Now, Charlemagne arranged very carefully to have one legitimate son because he didn't want to run up against that partitive inheritance problem. So he managed to go through this process of, I guess you would call it, well, it's not even monogamy, but serial marriage. He would marry somebody largely for political reasons, and then if a better prospect came along, he would put her aside and marry somebody else. And he had a whole bunch of concubines as well, women he was in kind of officially sanctioned relationships with, but wasn't technically married to. Charlemagne had just a passel of children, just a lot of them, more than a dozen, that were acknowledged by him. And apparently he spoiled them rotten, all of them. And he very much was affectionate and fond of his children. But he did this kind of legal maneuvering so that he would only have one legitimate son at the time that he died, so that he could pass his kingdom intact to Louis the Pious. And so he kind of legitimized and delegitimized various children throughout his life. He had a whole bunch of daughters too. And his relationship with his daughters was something that clergy at the time complained about endlessly. Because here's Charlemagne's trick. Ready? Get this. Charlemagne refused to allow any of his adult daughters to get married. Because he didn't want their sons-in-law to step up and be candidates for that partitive inheritance thing. So he refused to allow them to get legally married, but he's not a totally unreasonable man. So he had to come up with an excuse for the clergy who's like, why aren't you letting your daughters get married? And he's like, well, I just love them too much. I can't part from them and have them go off and live with husbands. It would be awful for me. So I'm sorry, but I'm too fond of them. They're going to have to live with me and travel with my court, etc. And then he just would turn a blind eye to the fact that they all had boyfriends and in some cases children of their own. And the clergy would complain and be like, why let your daughters get married? Don't they're living in sin with these people and cavorting, etc. And he'd be like, I don't know what you're talking about. My daughter, how dare you? Something like that. Meanwhile, he's like out in the backyard playing with the grandkids, lavishing them with gifts, generally just enjoying his life. But Charlemagne, his personal life was very exciting. But he did all of that to make sure that his empire wouldn't be split up. But then his son, Louis the Pious, inherits. Louis is going to rule, and he's going to follow a lot of Charlemagne's basic policies. He's going to try to standardize weights and measures. He's going to continue to finance the scriptoria. He's going to do all of those things that Charlemagne did. But he is going to knuckle under when it comes to his personal life. And when he dies, he's going to have four legitimate sons. And because of partitive inheritance, the empire would therefore be split up between them. Immediately, they go to war with each other. This is what Charlemagne didn't want to happen. His grandsons are doing it. They go into war against each other. By the time the war is over, three of them remain, Louis, Charles, and Lothar. And Lothar is going to get Italy. Louis, the German, is going to grab the eastern part of the empire, as well as the title Holy Roman Emperor. And then Charles is going to grab up what will later be France. And so he's going to get that bit. And all of this will be settled in the Treaty of Verdun in 843. The treaty itself is significant for a couple of reasons. One is it demonstrates the power of this cultural tradition of partitive inheritance to split up an empire, because that was what was traditionally done between heirs. Two, this is one of the first examples we see where French was treated as a language separate from Latin. So in the official copy of the Treaty of Verdun, it's provided in three languages. It's in German, like you would expect for people who speak German. It's in Latin, like you would expect, because that was the official business language that the clergy all used. But it's also written down into French, which was presented as a language that had separated enough from Latin, that it's based on Latin. It's separated enough from Latin at this point that you needed a translation to understand it if you spoke French, but you didn't speak Latin. So there you go. Alrighty, so we've seen one of the internal pressures. You have partitive inheritance that's going to be fracturing the empire from the inside. There's also going to be pressure on Charlemagne's empire from the outside, namely in the form of the Norse. And you'll have to bear with me and excuse the fact that I have chosen to include a contemporary picture here, since there's lots of TV series lately. Too good to be passed up. Anyway, you have people from Scandinavia, more or less, who are putting pressure on the remnants of Charlemagne's empire during the 9th century. They take advantage in part because of the dissemination, or the sort of fracturing that was already taking place when the empire split up with the civil war between the grandsons of Charlemagne. But they also have some tactical advantages. They come from Scandinavia. Most of them have full-time jobs, I suppose you could say, as farmers or fishermen, for the most part. Some of them do some other things as well, but that's what they do. And in their spare time, occasionally, they might go on expeditions that would be described as going Viking. Viking was originally a job, not a ethnic designation or anything. And in this, they would do some trading. They would do some traveling, and they would do some raiding along anywhere they could get to with their ships. Now, the ships are what constitutes the greater part of their tactical advantage and makes the Norse so dangerous. Here you have a preserved example of what's known as a longship. These are the types of boats used by the Norse in their Viking expeditions, and they have a few things that make them really distinctive. This particular one is the Osborg ship. This was a burial ship. A king died and was buried in 834, and he was buried inside his ship, which is why it's preserved so beautifully. If it had been continually used in the water, it would have eventually broken down and rotted. So it's not even necessarily one of the biggest examples of the ships that we know about, but it is definitely one of the most beautifully preserved. So you can see what these long ships looked like. They had a couple of features that you should note. Well, several, but they had a relatively simple kind of rigging structure. They just had a mast with a basic simple sail that was supposed to give them a little assistance. But a lot of the propulsion of these boats, you can see those holes that are right above that man on the right pictures, right above his head there. Those are oarlocks. And so they would have oars, and these boats would be rowed. A lot of the propulsion was provided that way. This gives them an advantage because they can move against the current. They can go, whether that's against the ocean current, which would be quite tiring, but they can also go up rivers. So against the flow of the river if they need to. And they can go with great speed if they're going along with the current. So they have oars that will help them with propulsion. They also have quite a pointed, sharp keel, you see that, which makes them quite stable and seaworthy. It's difficult to completely capsize a ship like this. They can sail even in quite rough and unpleasant waters, which gives them a very large range. And then the most important aspect of these long ships, of all of them, has to do with this very unique shape, this very broad shape with that sharp keel. So they're stable, they don't flip over easily, but because they have this kind of wide shape, they don't need a lot of water to float. The amount of water you need to float a boat is referred to as the draft, and most long ships require between 18 inches and at most 3 feet of draft. So they only need that much water in order to float. That means they can go anywhere. They can go right up to the shore. They don't need dinghies to kind of ferry people back and forth. They don't have to swim any to get into shore. You don't need a big pier or a dock in order to get your boat landed. You can pull right up to the beach in some cases and hop on out and get people in and out and goods in and out of your boat very easily. You can also go up rivers that are quite shallow. Anywhere there's water, you can sail one of these boats. And because they have those oars, they can get the boat against the current as well. And so what this means, what these long ships mean, is that they can be anywhere at the drop of a hat. Plus, they're so large, the longness and even the broadness of them, it means that they can put lots of people on them. Anywhere between 30 to 120, sometimes even up to 200 fully equipped and armed people men usually, but people, can be fit on these boats. And so if you can imagine what that's like to have 150 armed guys that only need 3 feet of water, they can land anywhere, jump out, steal everything that isn't nailed down, including people in some cases, jam them back on the boats, and then sail away again overnight, quickly, fast. And that means they can strike and take what they want and be gone before a large army could possibly react to them. So if you say we're trying to run a centralized empire or a kingdom, say the kingdom that will later be France, that has a single centralized army, and you're being attacked by the Norse in ships like this, you're constantly just losing. They're going to strike territory that they see any kind of wealth or things that are worth stealing, sometimes including people who will then be shipped through the Russian river system and sold on the slave market in Constantinople. But they strike monasteries especially and steal anything of value, books, altar cloth, anything that seemed to be valuable at all, wealth of any type. They will strike cities as well as villages. I mean, they are just anywhere they want to be all the time. And by the time you mobilize your single centralized army to go and stop them, they're gone, which means you've just taken damage and there's nothing you can do and your army is useless. So what can you do? This map, I know it's kind of tiny because of their, really, it's a question of scale, and they travel a long way, and so it makes the scale kind of small. But you see all those lines? These are places the Norse ended up going, and ended up attacking as well. All those red dots are places of major warfare and attack. They're going to be moving up the river systems. They're going to navigate through river systems. They're going to do a brisk trade between, say, Norway and Constantinople. You might be surprised by it, but that's true. They get all the way around the coasts of the Mediterranean. They're along the coasts of the northern Europe. They're going to go all the way into North America. There's going to be at least a brief attempt to set up a settlement there. Doesn't take. Greenland, Iceland, all of those places are going to be explored and in some cases settled by the Norse, who are using these long ships to get anywhere they want to be. And meanwhile, they're causing all kinds of political devastation and disruption. They're going to end up taking over big swaths of territory. England, Ireland will be constantly under attack as well. Big chunks of that will be conquered. And as well as you've got Denmark, Sweden, and Norway kind of all get sucked into what will be this kind of Norse sphere of influence. At various points, they're going to control so much territory, it will all be referred to as the Danelaw. This is where the Danes are ruling. And they're going to control lots of it. And they constantly undermine the rule of people trying to run the remnants of Charlemagne's empire. The King of France struggles and suffers, and he tries to keep them out of his kingdom, but he can't. France has all these big rivers. It's just impossible to keep them at bay. So what is he going to do? Well, there's two choices. The King of France can completely decentralize. He can simply say to his nobles, his vassals, look, I can't defend this territory with a single large army. There's no point in summoning the troops every time the Vikings attack, every time there's a new Norse invasion, because by the time we get there, they're going to be gone. And even if we could have beaten them in war, which we probably could if we were all together, it's going to be too late and it's useless anyway. So, what we're going to have to do instead is simply fortify the rivers and the coastline. You're going to have to split up basically and keep parts of the army kind of stationed in places where the Norse might attack. And there's a lot of these places, which means that local lords and rulers are going to have to be able to be allowed to build fortifications, to build castles and forts. And they're going to have to be allowed to maintain their own garrisons of troops right there, so that if Vikings happen by, they'll be able to respond right away. The problem with this is that if you're the king and your power relies on having this centralized army, you've just shot yourself in the foot because you've dispersed your army all over your country. And on top of dispersing your army, you've allowed these local leaders to build castles, which means if they decide they don't want to do what you say, they simply say, what are you going to do about it? And then you have to pull together what army you can and go after them. And now they're entrenched in their castle. And now you can't do anything because they can hold out for years in some cases. This is horrible for you as the king. You're like, this is terrible. I'm losing all my power. And that happens in France. The kings begin losing all their power. And in a stopgap measure, Charles the Simple, Charles III, is going to try to fix it so that he can retain at least some stability and not be completely destabilized by Viking invasions all the time. So in 911, he wins a battle against a guy named Rollo the Viking. I guess his actual name was Rolf, which begins Hrolf, is how that was spelled. But he's going to change it later, or it will be referred to in French as Rollo. But he's going to lose a battle. And like people, Vikings, if they've gone on expedition and happened to have lost and been captured by the king, he pretty much expected he'd be killed. He figured that's how it would go. But that's not what happens. Instead, Charles sits down to negotiate with him. It's not the first time negotiations have happened. In fact, a lot of how they make their money is because political leaders are willing to negotiate. But in this case, Charles offers an unprecedented deal. He sits down with Rollo and says, I'm not going to kill you. Look, here's what I'm going to offer. I want you to get all of your buddies, all of your friends, all of your family, anybody you know from the homeland. I want you to move them all over here, and I'm going to give you a big chunk of France in fief. That means I will technically be the king, you'll bow down and acknowledge that I'm the king, and that you're a noble who works for me, a vassal. And in return, I will give you this land to run as you see fit. You get to collect taxes. You get to maintain roads and bridges and then collect tolls on them. You get to oversee trade. You get to oversee land planting and take all the profits from the land that you're given to control outright. You get to tell the peasants what to do. You get to maintain your own court system. You get to do all the things that my vassals get to do. In return, I'm giving you this big chunk of land to just have for you and your family and your friends. I want one thing. I want you to promise me I'm never going to see another freaking Viking up my rivers again. You see Paris, that red dot? Right on the Seine. It's a big navigable river. And every freaking year before this, when it was Viking season, the Vikings would come sail up Paris, burn and loot and steal things, and cause all kinds of problems and destabilize the kingdom. And so in return for not having that, he's like, I want you to be the guard dog. I want you to make sure that doesn't happen. And in return, I'll just give you this much rent. You can just have it. Rollo says, okay, sure. This is an important kind of watershed moment because the Normans, the Northmen, who come to settle in this region, which comes to be named after them, Normandy, land of the Northmen, are going to be problematic vassals for the King of France. They're going to be great when it comes to doing all the stuff they're actually supposed to do in Normandy. They're great administrators. They learn to speak French. They are absolutely great at providing security and stability. They run the territory very efficiently and quite quite well, so that the local people prosper and they have nothing really to complain about. The downside, if you're the king, is that the Normans are not what you might call super obedient. They don't take direction all that well. They're resistant to being bossed around by the King of France. And over time, that territory they control only gets bigger and bigger and bigger. The Normans expand, they have more money, they have more power, they never forget how to make those longships, and they don't really obey the King of France all that well. It's going to be a part of how Charlemagne's empire really fragments, and for a while the kings of France have almost no power at all. Instead, their vassals, the dukes, the local lords, are really just running the show, and the Normans are kind of the most independent of an independent lot. Okay, so this all comes to a head in 1066. There was a whole bunch of exciting political stuff that went down. Remember the Danelaw? All the stuff that's in pink was once ruled by the same guy, Canute the Viking, in 1030. He dies. There's a whole sort of succession drama. And eventually it's taken over by Edward the Confessor, King of Wessex. He rules for a while and then he dies. Once he's gone, there's going to be a contest for who gets to take over England. There's going to be a Norwegian candidate, Harald Hardrade. There's going to be a guy in Wessex, Harold of Wessex, who's going to step up and say that he ought to inherit because he apparently had a promise from Edward the Confessor on his deathbed. And then there's Edward's first cousin once removed, not a close relative, William of Normandy. He's the Duke of Normandy. He's a descendant of Rollo. He's inherited and he's taken over and he's the vassal of the King of France, but he doesn't at all do what the King of France says. And apparently he and Edward at one time had a talk and Edward promised that William could be the next king. I don't know. It may have been completely made up. I'm not sure. But William sees an opportunity and he decides he's going to press a claim on England as well. And so the three of them are going to get into a fight over it. Harold and Harald fight each other at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066. Harald Hardrada is the Norwegian one. Harold of Wessex is going to win. And so he marches north, he fights Harald Hardrada, he manages to be victorious in this battle, and he marches south again, only to encounter the forces of William. William had crossed the channel, and you can see this beautiful primary source, a very unique primary source document. This is the Bayeux Tapestry. It was commissioned and made very shortly after 1066. It commemorates the invasion, and it depicts, it's a pictorial representation in embroidery. It's not actually a tapestry. Tapestries are woven. The Bayeux Tapestry is a piece of cloth that has been embroidered with these sort of lavishly beautiful images that show the story of the invasion of William the Conqueror. I guess it's a spoiler. He's going to win. And you can see some of the detail here. And in addition to the pictures, you can see that there is text as well that explains what's happening in each sort of panel, as it were. And so, as you can see, William is going to load a bunch of his followers up onto longships, and he's going to sail them across the channel and land in England, where he will encounter Harold of Wessex. So, there they are. They're coming to attack. So there's some lovely little details from the Bayeux Tapestry that just makes it absolutely a joy to use as a primary source document. One of them, you can see up here on the left, you've got Harold of Wessex meeting with Edward on his deathbed. And you can tell Harold is supposed to be kind of a jerk because he's depicted, he's the man standing with his hands out. There's a king on the bed there, and he's got that kind of strange, like, camel neck sticking out. And that's how you know you're not supposed to trust her like him. What kind of a jerk is this guy? But you also see another kind of like tidbit, a trivia tidbit about the Bayeux Tapestry on the right there. Isti mirant stella, they saw a star. 1066 was the Halley's Comet year, and this was considered a great portent. William will later say this was a sign from the heavens that he was meant to win this whole thing. Whether that's true or not, I can tell you that William's conquest worked quite well. He's going to encounter the forces of Harold of Wessex, and he's going to end up engaging in battle and winning. Here you see a panel that shows the death of Harold of Wessex. He's got an arrow in his eye. He's kind of in the middle there. You can't really see, the detail doesn't really show it, but he ends up getting shot in the eye and dies. And William ends up taking over England as William the Conqueror. Bum, bum, bum. And as William the Conqueror, he's going to be in a unique position. He's taking over England. And he is now set up because he's conquered it. He's won it by conquest. He doesn't have to deal with traditional political relationships that go back generations, and you've already negotiated how much tax money you're going to pay, and you've negotiated what your fees and your dues are. And if you try to raise those rates, people will just riot and it causes all kinds of problems. He's fresh on the scene. So what William is going to do is he's going to divide up England and he's going to hand it out to his supporters. But before he does that, he orders something called the Doomsday Book created. And the Doomsday Book is described by one scholar as a list of every chicken in Britain. It's an exhaustive list of every estate, every fief, every piece of land in England, and it will have everything on there. How many buildings are there? How many acres in crops? How many acres in pasture? How many acres of woodland? How much water is there? What kind of water? How many pieces of farm equipment do you have? It's literally a list of everything. So he knows exactly how much everything is worth. So that William, once he starts demanding tax money, can know exactly how much tax money he can squeeze out of every property in England. Because he has this chance to do this very efficiently, and because a lot of the people getting parcels of land are William's followers from France who already have land and property and wealth in France, he doesn't he can look at this stuff in England as kind of a bonus, kind of a luxury, and as a result he can squeeze more tax money out of England, which is in every way poorer than Normandy. It has fewer people, it's not as productive in terms of agriculture, the weather isn't as nice, and yet he can squeeze more money out of England than anybody in Europe is getting out of their territory at this time. No other medieval king is getting the same kind of return on his land and territory that William is getting. He's able to create a much more streamlined government as well to go with it because he's starting fresh. And so he's going to set England up to be kind of just a little ahead of the curve politically. They're going to be introducing institutions that the King of France is really going to struggle to try to implement in his own territory. And they also create this weird situation where William the Conqueror is the vassal. He's supposed to serve the King of France. At the same time, he's a king in his own right in England, which is not at all what the King of France wanted to happen, let me tell you. It makes it even harder to control William and the subsequent Dukes of Normandy because they really are not in a position to be bossed around. Okay, so we also have the rise and emergence of papal power in Western Europe. I'm not going to get into too much detail about this. I'm just going to give you the very fast version. But monasteries continue to be very important, logically enough, in the Middle Ages. And a new type of monastery will be founded in 909 by William of Aquitaine. I know everybody has the same name. You just kind of have to roll with it. But Aquitaine is a duchy. So William is the duke in the southern part of France. And so it's kind of just immediately below Normandy, if you will. Big, powerful. William is really rich and he's quite independent. And he creates a new kind of monastery at Cluny. It's still a Benedictine monastery, but what makes it special is that William sets it up to be completely independent of political control. Usually when rich guys set up monasteries, they put a little codicil in there that said, when I retire, I'd like to retire there and become the abbot. And so I get to continue being important and influential and have a comfortable life, but I don't have to be technically part of the rat race anymore. William doesn't do that. Sometimes when people establish monasteries, they say, I want to have say over who gets to be in charge of the monastery because I don't want them to do anything that would be contrary to the interests of my family. Sometimes monasteries are set up to be under the umbrella of the local bishop who gets to tell them what to do. Cluny isn't like that. Cluny is set up to be completely independent. Even the local bishop can't tell them what to do. And the reason William of Aquitaine sets it up like that is because local bishops very frequently are the brothers of whoever the local duke is. They tend to be members of the same noble families because those are the families who pull strings to make sure that important church jobs, because the church works so closely with the government and because the church controls so much wealth and so much land and so much influence, they want to make sure that they lock up important church jobs as well as important political jobs. But Cluny doesn't do that. Cluny is set up to be truly independent, to be a place that it will be a center of learning. So all the sort of greatest thinkers and scholars that are working in the church at that time can go there. All the people who are serious about dedicating themselves to spiritual purity can go there. And they can live at Cluny and work completely without the interference of politics. They don't have to answer to anybody. With one exception. There's only one emergency oversight person for the Cluny Monastery, because you can't have a situation where they're truly just answer only to themselves, even if that's mostly what they actually do. What if things start going really wrong? What if they start behaving really badly? You have to have some kind of check and balance. And so what William of Aquitaine writes into their charter, he says, the only person who can tell Cluny, sit in judgment over their abbot, for instance, or tell them what to do, is the Pope. Now, in 909, the Pope was not a powerful figure. He was really not going to do anything about this job. He is living in Rome, has no idea what's going on in Aquitaine. It's really just a in case of emergency situation that William of Aquitaine and the abbot of Cluny never would have really thought was going to happen. But it's really historically important because it opens the door. Everybody, William of Aquitaine creates this monastery where people can really be dedicated to their spiritual lives. It's massively inspirational. Not only do all the sort of great church thinkers flock there and begin writing, which circulates everywhere, and start talking about how important it is for the church to be independent of worldly interference, and how great that is, and how important and religiously and significant it is, and how fantastic it is for the good of humanity and so forth. But because William does this, a whole bunch of other rich dukes and others are like, well, if he's doing that and getting in good with God this way, they're putting in a word for him, because anybody who's politically important at this point is carrying on quite a bit of warfare, and they're killing people left and right, and there's some concern about that. And one of the reasons they keep paying for these monasteries is that they really hope this is a way to hedge their bets, that when they die, maybe they won't exactly go straight to hell. That's what they're hoping anyway. So you have a whole bunch of other people who don't want to be one-upped by this. And so there's all these daughter houses that have the same kind of rule as Cluny. They're set up to not answer to anybody but the Pope, and they spread all over Europe. And the thing is, what happens in the long run is that you have all these monasteries that technically can only be overseen by the Pope, even though in 909 he's not very powerful. If you fast forward 150 years, that starts to change, and the Pope has a ready-made excuse to come and interfere. All these monasteries own land. All of them have political connections, whether they actually subject to political forces or not. And so now the Pope has a reason to interfere with all of that all across Europe. And then you add in, see that guy over there on the right, some other political forces that are going to draw the Pope into conflict. There's something that happens, it's called the Ottonian Reform in the 11th century. The Holy Roman Emperor, who's controlling the eastern part of what used to be Charlemagne's empire, didn't have quite as many Vikings to deal with. There were some, but he did have a lot of local nobles that were very defiant and doing what they want, and they aren't obeying him, and he doesn't like that, and he wants to centralize and consolidate power. And one of the ways he figures out to do that is to go around and remove all those bishops who were the brothers of the local noble, because they always stick together like glue, and put them on trial to see if they got their job through something called simony, buying a church job, or if perhaps they might be guilty of one of the common sins that clergy are not supposed to be doing at this time, but was really common. Things like being married. They're not allowed to be married, but they kind of were, or having affairs with people if they're not officially married, that kind of thing. And so he puts a bunch of these bishops on trial to see if they're worthy of their job. And lo and behold, practically all of them bribed their way into their job. Practically all of them are having a little on the side. And it was a ready-made excuse to remove them and replace them with his own people, people who were loyal to him. So if the bishop was somebody he thought he could trust, he'd let them apologize and do penance and he'd keep them in place. If not, he'd get him out and put his own guy in there instead. And the bishop who was loyal to the king could then serve as a check against the local nobles because he's no longer from the same family. That was going on. And this extends all the way to the office of the Pope in Rome. What happened? This goes back to Henry III. He travels to Rome at one point and was going to celebrate Christmas Mass. Once he gets there, he's absolutely horrified to find out there are 3 different people all claiming to be the Pope. There had been one of those elections. Nobody would admit defeat. Everybody's running around to be Pope. Everybody's issuing rules signed. The Pope says this is the official position of the church. Nobody knows who's actually in charge. It's a wreck. And so Henry's like, oh, forget this. I'm not having it. All 3 of you are out. None of you are worthy to be Pope. I'm putting my own guy in. A serious reformer. Somebody who really cares about the church and its spiritual authority and is serious about cleaning up this mess, this horrible politically corrupt disaster that is going on here in Rome. Well, it becomes a classic case of being careful what you wish for, because one of the first things that the Pope that Henry III installs does is he takes steps to separate the church from the power of political leaders. They do things like create the College of Cardinals so that they can actually make the election of the next pope more legitimate and take away the power of the, say, Holy Roman Emperor to make decisions about who ought to be the next pope. They also take a bunch of other steps to kind of clean up the church hierarchy. And all of this is kind of geared at separating the power of the Pope from the power of the emperor or of kings or of other political leaders. So fast forward a little bit of time. And what happens is that a conflict arises between Gregory VII, who's one of these hardcore reformer popes, and the new emperor. Henry III dies, and Henry IV takes over. And they get into a big fight over whether the emperor has the right to depose bishops and put in people that he approves of. Now, Henry III had done that night and day and night. He did that with popes, for crying out loud. So that when Gregory VII says to Henry IV, hey, maybe you shouldn't do that. Maybe only the church should be appointing and deposing clergy. Henry IV says, no way, man. That's ridiculous. I'm not listening to you. If you're going to push this issue and say that I, the emperor, have no right to do this, well, then I'll just take my army south and we'll see about you. So Henry gets into a conflict with Gregory. Gregory pulls a really clever move. He sends an open letter out to all the vassals of the Holy Roman Emperor. Now remember that Henry's father, Henry III, had been trying his darndest to consolidate power at the expense of all his vassals, at the expense of all his nobles. And so he'd undercut their influence. He'd imposed all these bishops who were from other families and from that were constantly a thorn in the side of whoever the local noble was. He'd done all these steps which they didn't like. And so they don't like the Holy Roman Emperor, and they would really like a chance to stick it to him. So Gregory knows this, and he sends an open letter basically saying, if the Holy Roman Emperor is going to try to remove me, the Pope, I declare that he's excommunicated or kicked out of the church. And if he's excommunicated, that means he can't be the sanctioned, sanctified, and ordained emperor and king of this territory. He can't do that job because he's kicked out of the church. And that means that his vassals are absolved of whatever oaths and promises and contracts they have signed with him. You no longer have to obey him because the church has kicked him out. So all of those vassals who were just waiting for an excuse jump on this like a duck on a June bug. They're on it. They're like, aha, ha ha, the Pope says we don't have to obey you. So they begin immediately making plans. They're going to get together. They're going to go after and remove Henry IV. They're going to put somebody else who's perhaps weaker and not as important in his place. They're getting together kind of like a civil war machine to go after him. They also make all these plans. They're like, we're going to put him on trial. It's going to be great. And the Pope will preside over the trial, and then we'll remove him from office and put somebody else in. It's going to be fantastic. And the Pope is really down with this. He's like, this is going to be great. It's going to be great because you're setting a precedent here where the Pope presides over the trial of an emperor and decides whether he's worthy or not. This is fantastic. I'm really looking forward to it. So he begins marching to the north to preside over this trial. Meanwhile, Henry IV is panicking. He's like, I've got to get out of this. This is a horrible situation. Things are going wrong. I called up my army, my vassals, and they won't come. They said they don't have to obey me anymore, and they're going to put me on trial, and I'm going to get kicked out. It's going to be awful. So he races to the south to intercept the Pope. He runs into him at the kind of mountain town of Canossa, where he outfoxes Gregory, because Gregory may be politically ambitious. I'm not saying he isn't, but he is sincere. He walks the walk, he talks the talk. He's sincere about his spiritual mission. So when the emperor corners him, he takes refuge inside a fortress. The emperor does not attempt to attack him. That would just be suicidal. He knows his vassals would take him out. Instead, he dons the garment of a penitent, sackcloth and ashes. You can see him looking sad there in the picture over on the left. He's the one in the brown sack. He dons the garment of a penitent, a person who is sorry, making an apology, penance, making up to for their sins, and goes crawling on his knees to the Pope. He literally stands outside in the snow barefoot for hours before the Pope agrees to see him finally. And then he goes up to the Pope, bows to the ground, and kisses the Pope's feet and begs for forgiveness. And because the Pope is actually a serious clergy person, when he's presented with a penitent who's begging for forgiveness, he sees it as his sacred Christian duty to forgive him. So I can only imagine he was furious about the whole thing, but he had no choice. And so he forgives Henry, and he offers him the absolution, and he goes and he has to send another open letter saying, guys, how I said you were justified in rebelling against the emperor? Well, not anymore. Sorry. The whole thing is off. We're not having the trial. Sorry, folks. The vassals weren't super pleased about this, but it does give Henry IV enough breathing room. Enough of them decide to stop moving forward with their attempt to unseat him, that he's able to kind of gather up a list of who his enemies are and go after them one at a time. He once again is kind of united with the church, but it's an important precedent. This is one of the first times you have a leader like Henry IV go head to head in a dispute over whose authority is superior, the emperor or the Pope, and lose. Even though it's largely symbolic, he had to bow down and kiss the feet of the Pope and beg for forgiveness. Now, it only happened because his vassals were looking for an excuse to disobey him. A different leader with a different political situation whose vassals were loyal wouldn't have to fear the Pope in the same way. But it nevertheless does set a precedent. Okay. Alrighty. So, what's going on elsewhere? Well, we'll go on back to the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire. They are under siege. There's a new political game in town, the Seljuk Turks, and they are spreading. Their territory is expanding into land that was held by the Eastern Roman Empire increasingly. And so, feeling particularly threatened, the leader of that Eastern Roman Empire, Alexios Komnenos, is going to send letters to basically everybody he can think of, begging for help and support. Anybody he can think will send him some money, or perhaps some mercenary troops, or anything. He sends them a letter saying, things are really bad, I'm losing territory to the Turks, you got to come and help me. One of those letters goes to Urban II, and it wasn't even addressed to him because there was enough of a cultural divide at this point between the Eastern Empire and the Pope in the West that they weren't necessarily on great speaking terms to begin with. There was a series of schisms. It's a long story. We're not going to get into it. But at any rate, one of these letters, these desperate pleas, goes to Urban II, who's the Pope at the time, and he has a fabulous, innovative new idea in his own mind. Urban decides this is a way to kill two birds with one stone. There are all these problems in Europe. Vassals, people who are minor nobility or the younger sons of major nobility who don't stand to inherit much, because at this point, that partitive inheritance, it's still in place. It's still being practiced around Europe, but increasingly less so, where nobles are choosing one of their children to inherit most of their lands and titles in order to keep them together and stop them from being fragmented. And so if you were one of the people who was not set to inherit, you would have been raised with relative comfort and luxury. You would have been taught how to fight, fight on horseback in armor, which is a very particular skill. But at the end of the day, you're not going to inherit any land. You have to figure out how to make a living, and that can be challenging. You either have to hire on as a vassal of somebody, as a knight who isn't given land but has to do the same kind of thing. You can work as a freelance, which is a person who has a lance and is not contracted with anybody. You go pick up military contracts. Or you can do what a lot of them did, which is just kind of hang around your dad's territory, causing problems for people. Sometimes working as an out-and-out bandit, robbing people on the road. Sometimes attacking your neighbors and trying to take their stuff. Basically, there is a whole class of like these younger sons of nobles who are nothing but like bandits and ruffians and general horrible people to be around, who are constantly warring with each other and causing all kinds of chaos and destruction and devastation and death. So Urban sees this as the problem of the church. He also gets this letter from Alexius Comnenus saying, oh, the lands of the Eastern Roman Empire, the great holy lands sacred to Christianity, are being captured and taken away by people who aren't even Christian. Do something out of brotherly love. And is like, aha, two birds with one stone. I know what I can do about this. So he gives a speech at Clermont in 1095, which is in France. He'd made a big announcement beforehand and said, I have this really cool announcement. Everybody show up. And so he addresses it to the clergy. The clergy show up. And he makes this big announcement where he basically says, the Turks have attacked the Holy Land. Jerusalem, by the way, it's just a side note, had been in the hands of one Islamic leader or another for more than 100 years. This was not news. But nevertheless, the Holy Land is under attack. The Eastern Empire is besieged. And here's what I think we ought to do. Everybody who's currently in Europe causing problems, attacking each other, you should quit that, go off, and attack people who aren't Christian. Not only is that acceptable, but it will be rewarded because I, with the power of the keys of St. Peter, because I'm the Pope, will grant you complete remission of your sins, a complete forgiveness of your sins if you go on this expedition and die. So you get to go right to heaven. I'm using the Petrine doctrine. Off you go. And he figures this is a way to solve both problems. It gets rid of those ruffians causing problems in Europe, ships them out of there so that the clergy in Europe don't have to live with them or deal with them. And at the same time, he figures it'll go off and kill people who aren't Christian. Good. Fair deal. I want to emphasize this is a completely innovative idea. Before 1095, no pope, no leader had thought they had the power to simply summon people off to go to war. And they did, to some extent, call on people to help them, usually political leaders, but they didn't simply say, everyone go to war, I say so. And they certainly didn't expect that to work if they did try it. And they also did not introduce this idea that you could wage war as an act of penance, that you could wage war in the same way you could go on pilgrimage or pray for forgiveness of your sins, that this was a way you could demonstrate your faith and could therefore earn salvation. It is a really radical and new idea. And it hinges on this notion that killing people who aren't Christian is not a sin. In fact, it's a good thing to do. It's Christian holy war, and it is the foundation of the First Crusade. Okay, so what happens as a result shocks even Urban. On the one hand, you have a wave of people who responded exactly the way he expected. All of those ruffian younger sons read between the lines. When he said you could go marching off to the Holy Land, there's kind of land up for grabs here where you could grab it and get yourself rich and set yourself up a new lovely little kingdom. Wouldn't that be great? They think to themselves, awesome, we're definitely going to do that. And so they start making plans. But warfare expeditions in the 11th century are complicated. You have to figure out your transportation, you have to get your horses and your armor, and you have to call in all the troops, and it's complicated to get everybody all together. It takes logistics and planning, and it takes some time. In the meanwhile, what Urban absolutely did not anticipate at all is that common people hear this. The crusade is preached in general churches, and so ordinary people think to themselves, well, if that's what's happening, I should do something too. This is radically weird in medieval politics and in medieval warfare, because there was this real class distinction between who fights and who doesn't in the Middle Ages. In the 11th century, peasants did not take part in wars, or they very rarely did. In case of extreme emergencies, they might man fortifications or provide some help, but generally speaking, they did not. Warfare was an elite occupation. It was something that nobles did and people they directly hired to do. And that was it. Peasants were needed on the land to keep farming, to keep the economy running. And so they didn't really trouble themselves with wars, generally speaking. This is one of those first exceptions to that. Well, not the very first exception, but it's an exception to that, where people are like, well, I'd better go off too. And so they just form a mob and they start marching toward Constantinople. They don't really have much in the way of planning. They don't have much in the way of supplies. They don't have any experience. They don't know what they're doing. But you shouldn't think that they're not dangerous. Farmers are strong. And if they decide they're going to go and attack people, they generally are a force to be reckoned with. And so you have these common people. They go off to fight in the crusade. They're inspired by the Pope. The Pope has called them to war, and even though they have no experience and no reason to ever be involved in that, they decide to do it. Even Urban had no idea he had that kind of pull. He had no idea this would work. But there it goes. The People's Crusade, as it was known, they have some charismatic leaders. They go marching off, and they cause all kinds of problems on their way. They, as I said, don't really have enough supplies. They don't have any plans. They don't really know how to do this. And so they really rely on people in the towns they pass through to help them. And while they're still in France, this works out okay, because they get from town to town. I tell everybody what they're up to. New recruits are going to join. People in the town are going to help them out with supplies and various other stuff that they might need, food, that kind of thing, shelter, temporarily at least. Once they get further away, though, from where they started, the group gets bigger, more threatening. Bunch of strangers, a lot of them from France, start rolling up into these German-speaking towns in places like Metz and Cologne and Worms and Mainz. And the local populations are like, I don't know about this. This seems pretty sketchy. I don't think we do want to join this group, number one. And number two, we definitely don't want to clean out the pantry to feed them while they happen to be here. And as towns became more reluctant and time was moving on and people got a little bit hungrier and a little more desperate, the People's Crusade started getting much more aggressive. They started threatening these towns they were walking through. Specifically, they felt justified in doing this whenever they could identify Jewish populations. And large towns in Eastern Europe did have Jewish populations in them, very typically. And so what happened is predictable, I suppose. It turns into I don't know if you want to call it a rampage. It's certainly a rolling massacre of people in these various towns, where Jewish quarters would be targeted to be looted, people attacked and slaughtered on the same justification that the Pope used to call people to go on crusade in the first place. Since they're not Christian, it was generally assumed that killing them and taking their stuff would not be a sin. This is not a universal opinion, I should emphasize. And there were even members of the clergy who did their very level best to prevent this from happening. In Mans, for instance, there was a relatively small Jewish population. They ran to the bishop for help and support because they heard that these crusaders were coming and that they were going to kill everybody basically on the grounds that they weren't Christian, and so it was okay. And they begged the bishop for help and protection, and the bishop says, sure, I don't want you to be killed. That's crazy. So why don't you take shelter in my house, in my residence? I'll go out and talk to them. And so the bishop goes out and tells the leaders of this movement they have to go away. It's like, you cannot attack and murder people in our town. I don't care what you think your justification is, go away. And they murder the bishop and burn down his palace and kill everyone inside. That's the kind of thing that you associate with this People's Crusade. Okay, so, and I suppose I should have summed up before I do it. The People's Crusade do get all the way to Constantinople. Alexius Comnenus, the emperor, has no idea who they are or what they want. He's going to ferry them across the Bosporus. He does not let them into Constantinople. He ferries them across the Bosporus and says, okay, have fun. As soon as they encounter an actual army of Turks, they're slaughtered, and that's the end of it. But it accomplishes two things. One, it demonstrates just how much social power, political power, the Pope has. He can tell people who have no business going to war to go to war, and they do it. That was shocking. Two is it really lowers the expectations of the Seljuks as to how dangerous these people from Europe are that might be showing up on their doorstep. And when the Prince's Crusade, the real professional army, shows up, Kilij Arslan and various other leaders of what is now Turkey are unprepared. They don't realize how dangerous it is until it's too late. Okay, so eventually the real professional army does show up. And shockingly, the First Crusade really, there's going to be 4 major ones, is really the only one that is significantly successful. And really even that is very surprising. But shockingly, the real army is going to be successful. They're going to take town after town, city after city, region after region. It is a kind of a grinding process. But in the end of this, they are actually going to recapture Jerusalem. They're going to grab this territory and establish new little kingdoms called Crusader States in it. And the whole course of this attack is absolutely hideously brutal. They slaughter everybody in their path. They kill massive numbers of Christians along with Jewish people and Muslims, because they don't speak any of the local languages and they absolutely cannot distinguish between an Armenian Christian and, say, a Turkish Muslim. They don't know what they're talking about or what they're looking at, and they generally don't care either. These are people who are in many ways going to embody the most sort of brutal cliche about medieval warfare that you can think of. They kill everybody, they steal everything, they cause all kinds of problems. They're oddly religious at the same time. They're a bit of a conundrum. But the process of winning the First Crusade is ultimately going to be the watershed moment. It's going to be the beginning of the end. At the one hand, it's the pinnacle of what we think of as medieval mindset, medieval warfare, medieval behavior. At the same time, it is the beginning of the end of all of those things. The process of conquering and then ruling these new Crusader states, this territory in the Holy Land, introduces the people who went on the First Crusade to totally radical new ways of thinking about the world and new ways of living. All of these cities that they have conquered are cosmopolitan centers of the ancient world. They're places where trade is more important in many cases than agriculture. They're places where people from all over consolidate and mingle and live together side by side. They're places of learning and the preservation of the ancient world's technology and its architecture and its art and its science and mathematics and all of the things that go along with that, and law and tradition. And so by introducing those ideas, things like public baths, we'll get to that, to these people who have come from Central Europe, it is going to absolutely alter Europe's mindset about their place in the world and about what they could aim for in terms of governments back home. Okay, so these new principalities or Crusader states are established by the leaders of the First Crusade. They grab up territory and they set about trying to rule it. And in so doing, they actually initiate a whole lot of changes. So as you can see from the map that's on the right there, there's big swaths of territory, most of which is taken from the Seljuks. And is going to be converted into these new kind of political institutions that now these really brutal, very basic feudal lords from Europe, from Western Europe, are going to have to try to get with the program to figure out how to rule, because they're absolutely full of people in this part of the Mediterranean from a very sophisticated cosmopolitan populations. So they have to figure out how they're going to get on with that. Okay, so part of the institutions that will be invented at this time to deal with it, at least in part, are the militant orders. These, it should be an oxymoron, but these are Christian monks who have a military purpose or see themselves as having a military purpose. The Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller are both going to kind of take as their job the facilitation of people moving from Europe to, say, Jerusalem and back, to the Holy Land and back. The Knights Templar see it as their job to protect pilgrimage routes. The Knights Hospitaller, again, see it as their job to offer shelter and protection to people who are traveling. And that's where we get the word hospital and hostel and hospitality. It's all based on that same word, and that Knights Hospitaller use that word to describe what it is that they're doing, offering this hospitality to pilgrims on their way. And part of this included building monasteries and fortresses in Europe, but also right throughout this conquered territory. This is important because the Knights Templar, for instance, is just a little example of how the Crusades are going to transform society in Europe. The Knights Templar end up providing an extra service. In addition to fighting in wars, which they will do because this land is going to be slowly retaken by, well, local peoples and Turks, and then you have also Kurds and some Arabs and Egyptians. They're all going to kind of get in on it eventually. But in addition to fighting in those kinds of conflicts in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Knights Templar are also going to provide services for those pilgrims, as I mentioned. There's going to be a wave of popular travel. People who have basically a desire to improve their chances in the afterlife or to see the world or a little bit of both will go on pilgrimages where they will often walk from Europe to Jerusalem and back. It takes a long time and it's quite dangerous. And so they use the services of the Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller in order to provide themselves shelter while they do this. And one of the side notes, I'm not going to get into all of the detail about that, but one of the side notes that's interesting about this is that the Knights Templar end up providing this extra financial service. Because a pilgrim would be gone for a long time, they don't necessarily want to leave their money behind. Even if they were to bury it or hide it somewhere, what if they die while they're on pilgrimage? No one will ever find it. It will be a waste. That would be bad. And they don't want to leave it in the open because it may be stolen or used up or abused by their family members. They don't want that either. They also don't want to carry it because what if they're robbed? So they start asking the Knights Templar, you've got these fortified monasteries. How about if maybe I leave my stuff with you and you write me a little receipt? I'll go on pilgrimage, I'll come back, and then I'll come pick it up. And the Knights Templar say, sure, sounds like the kind of thing we ought to do. Christian duty and all that. And so they do it. people start putting their money and valuables in the treasury of the Knights Templar, get a little receipt, go off on pilgrimage, come back, and they pick it up. And logically enough, after the Knights Templar have provided this wonderful service for them, it's pretty typical to offer a little donation. It's not necessary. The Knights Templar will do this for free, but they'll offer a little donation, a little honorarium to say thank you for your service that helped me out while I was on pilgrimage. It's also popular to leave stuff to the Knights Templar in your will, Knights Hospitaller too, once you've died, just, as a recognition. It's kind of a popular move to do. And so the Knights Templar start accumulating a lot, bigger and bigger treasuries. Some of it outright belongs to them, some of it was donated, some of it they're just holding for other people, but they've got lots of money at their disposal. And so they have this kind of big cash, capital pool. And so, logically, and perhaps obviously, although it's only obvious once somebody does it, this service begins expanding. Because people are going on pilgrimage, they're going to be gone for a couple of years, probably. That's the most common length of time to be gone. You don't want to carry your money with you because you could be robbed, but it's a long time to be gone. What if you need more or would like more than you want to carry? Well, this is the very simplification of this idea, but somebody comes up with this brilliant idea. What if I put money in to the treasury in France? You write me a receipt, and then I travel to Syria or to Jerusalem or somewhere, go to a Knights Templar fortress there, hold up my receipt, and take some money out. And they take your receipt and they cross off. You started with 10 gold pieces, cross that off, give you 2 gold pieces, and write a new receipt that says now you have 8. And so when you get back, you can only take 8 out of the treasury, and it's all pooled money and it just washes out. And it's the same. You put money in one place and take it out somewhere else. Dun, dun, dun! It's banking! This is one of the things that is going to be an idea that will be popularized by the First Crusade, and a way to transform the economy of Europe, which had been very local, very agrarian before that. Okay, in addition to that, there's the sheer scale and just massive impressiveness of the cities of the Eastern Mediterranean. These are the great remnants of the ancient world. Things like huge, thick city walls. This is up there, if you can see that picture that's on your right. This is a sewer. that's part of the underwater kind of sewer system that is keeping things flowing and clean in Constantinople. And then over here on your left, on the bottom, you see public baths. Things like that were unthinkable. They were unheard of. There were no cities of that kind of scale. Paris was the closest, and it was very much a cow town compared to Constantinople or Antioch or Edessa or Jerusalem. Those places were large. They had big populations, cosmopolitan populations. People from all over the world, different religions, different cultures would come there. They would trade. There would be communication. There'd be different ideas exchanged. They'd live side by side. There'd be all of this very flourishing and vibrant culture. In addition to all of the great monumental achievements of the ancient world, architecturally, artistically, and engineering-wise, it's just everywhere. And so this would be a very visceral confrontation to people who went on pilgrimage and people who participated in the Crusades, that there is a different, grander scale way to live your life. In addition to that, there's the very literal influence of the art, science, mathematics, and basic cultural advancements that had taken place in this part of the world. The very cutting edge of medicine, anatomy, biology, physics, optics, chemistry, those were being done by Arabic-speaking scholars during this time period. Baghdad was the absolute epicenter of scientific advancement in the 11th and 12th centuries. And so those texts were available in these territories now taken over by the Crusaders, and they were available to be translated, and they were translated and shipped back to Europe to go into the greedy, grasping hands of people, of scholars who were desperate to have them and fascinated by them. And so these works and this knowledge and information combined with preserved knowledge of things like Euclidean geometry, various other kind of advanced mathematic texts survived from the Greek versions that had been preserved in Arabic libraries. Those are going to be translated and reintroduced to Europe, or introduced in some cases, to people who are very interested in them. And this is going to push Europe yet again in a direction that is leading us out of the Middle Ages and toward the modern period. They're going to be using things like Arabic numerals to do different and new kinds of math that weren't possible if you're using the Latin version, which I don't know if any of you have ever tried to do fancy math with Roman numerals, but it's not easy. And so this is all going to drive technological change. It's all going to drive intellectual change. It's going to drive philosophical change. There's going to be just tons and tons and tons of change as a result of the First Crusade, including the establishment of the very first university, the University of Bologna. And now we're coming full circle to back to one of the things I said would be important in previous lectures. Remember Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of Roman law, body of civil law, Roman law, and his digest. Those compilations of Roman law codes that were meant to simplify and explain what the law was in Rome and give the whole historical context. Well, the very first university ever to exist is founded in the Italian city of Bologna by scholars, mostly clergy, who are interested in studying this law code. They get copies of it, they copy it all down, they read it, they talk about it, they hash it out, they compare it to other pieces of writing they happen to know about, they compare it to the law codes of their current political institutions, and it becomes important not just because it's an advancement of learning, because it becomes a keystone, an important part of moving political development forward in Europe, away from the lord and vassal medieval way of doing things, and toward something that in some ways tries to recreate what the Romans did, in other ways tries to take what the Romans did and twist it to make it fit with European political reality. But in both cases, what they're doing is they're moving Europe toward a more modern political structure, toward a more modern political legal structure that can consolidate power into a bureaucratic administration instead of letting every little local noble run everything. That is going to be thinking on a grand scale, a scale of empires, in order to form I guess a more, I don't know if efficient is the right word, but a different style of rulership. In many ways, it's a step toward the modern world. So, the rest of it's true as well. Goods that are coming from the end of the Silk Road and the Spice Road, the trade routes of the Mediterranean, are going to be linked up once again with the Far East and the goods of the Far East, the luxuries of the Far East. And that's going to create city-states in northern Italy, for instance, that are going to turn their economy over to a much larger proportion of it coming from trade versus agriculture. And they're going to create new political institutions to match up with that. They're going to declare political independence from the Holy Roman Emperor, for instance, and they're going to use their wealth to translate into new political independence and power. The rest of Europe is going to be interested in the broader world in a way they hadn't been for some centuries. They're going to be engaged with the idea of trading, interacting, exploring, and expanding their connections to that world, if only through luxury goods. But basically, through this point of contact after the First Crusade, it is going to create a great appetite in Europe to change, to do things in new ways. and to think about what other structures of government, what other structures of society can be implemented, whether they can build fabulous big buildings and wonderful, fantastic sewer systems and all that kind of wonderful stuff. Okay, so as I mentioned, huge technological advances kind of result from the First Crusade and the subsequent ones. Big military advances. There's going to be um, it's going to take a while before gunpowder is going to be anything like in use. It's going to be another few centuries, but there's going to be slight interest in gunpowder, new innovations in armor, metalworking, the style of metal that turns into high quality steel, for instance. The Damascus blades will be popular at this point. Defensive buildings, siege machinery, so both how to build fortifications and how to break fortifications, ballistics. And all of that kind of new weaponry is going to be put into place. It's going to change for good or ill warfare in Europe. Then you also have advances, massive technological advances in glass, optics, architecture, shipbuilding, navigation, and the greater demand for shipbuilding and navigation as well to carry out this trade. Agriculture, engines like the windmills and water mills, the production of distilled alcohol, the use of chimneys and cranes and clocks, all of those wonderful things are going to be introduced to Europe, and it's going to start the process of really transforming the landscape. So, that will be the interesting thing. In many ways, the Crusade is the pinnacle of the medieval mindset. On the other ways, it's the beginning of the end of medieval Europe and the start of the modern world. So that's it. Thanks a lot. It's the end. So long.